Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
As soon as one defies the Roman authority and goes in another direction, that there's no principle that would keep one from defying the new authority that would be set up. I mean, Luther found this already in his own time, of his own followers and disciples, in a sense, becoming more radical than he was, and they felt the need to disassociate from him. And that's been the history of Christianity since, is this fragmentation.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Dr. Charles Benedetti, a professor of history at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik and Dr. Benedetti will be discussing individualism and the biblical tradition. Now, here's Father Bacik.
Chuck, I want to thank you for taking time out from your busy schedule. You're one of the busier people I know and one of the more productive individuals, so I'm greatly appreciative that you've taken time to be on the program with me. I want to talk about the general question of individualism. I'm not sure how exciting that is to people immediately, but to me it represents the problem of how we function as citizens of this country while maintaining our autonomy, or how we relate to church involvement while retaining our own self-interest. It's largely a question of balance, or putting things together, of how we're achieving our own self-actualization but also contributing to the common good. I think in those terms almost everybody experiences the problem. We might try to put it in Christian kind of terms, or broadly religious terms. That is, how are people responsive to the call of God in their lives, the echo of God's Word in their own conscience, and at the same time members of a parish or a congregation or of a church. How does the Bible look at all of that, in other words? And I think when we generally have seen the problem of individualism in the current day, it's been much in terms of, well, we've gone too far in that direction, that this individualism has run rampant, that people are doing their own thing, and so on, and that we haven't had enough concern for the public good, for the common weal, for the common good in general. So I think that's the kind of question I would like to wrestle with, and I'd like to take a slant on it and talk about the kind of individualism we find in the Bible, a biblically based individualism, because I think there is such a thing. And perhaps I just, do you want to stop me here, because I carry on a little bit longer yet? It does seem to me that there's two kinds of notions at work in the Bible. One clearly is that we are saved as a people. So among the Israelites, they are a member of a large community. God forms that community in the Exodus event when they're taken out of the slavery of Egypt, and He makes a covenant with the whole people of Israel. And one is saved not individually or by one's own separate efforts, but as a member of that group, that collectivity known as the people of God, the nation of Israel. But there's another strain of thought in the Bible, too, that talks about God speaking to the individual and sort of going out of the norms. The prime example of that would be God's call to Abraham. So Abraham's called to leave his country. God calls Abraham to even go outside the normal laws and the normal common sense of sacrificing his own son Isaac. It's a very individuated call, a call to the heart, to the conscience of a person that doesn't seem to have much connection with what the group thinks, with what conformity would call for what the laws would indicate. It is a very concrete, individualized call. So in the Bible, I think I see the roots of this whole business of individualism and the relationship to the community. The struggle is already within the biblical period, it seems to me. Now, I want to try to put that into the American context, and here's where I'd like to call on your expertise a little bit. In Robert Bella's book called Habits of the Heart, he talks about a biblical individualism, and he talks about John Winthrop as being a representative figure of this biblical individualism. I think Winthrop's dates, as Bella mentions, 1588 to 1649, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I'd like to talk a little bit about John Winthrop now in terms of what he might tell us about this whole business of individualism and community. So you want to say, just fill me in a little bit on John Winthrop and who he was a little bit and what kind of person and so on?
I think he's a man who well exemplifies this tradition, and a man who in his own lifetime very aggressively tried to address the tensions involved in trying to realize individual salvation as against the demands of the community and the understanding that the community required some kind of assistance and direction. John Winthrop, for his time, was a very successful and achieving man. He was a lawyer. He was admitted to the inner inns of the law in London. He was a man who was educated at Cambridge, and he decided for his own reasons in the 1620s that God was punishing England, that hard times were coming upon England, and it was necessary for biblically minded Christian reformers, and he thought of himself as a Puritan, one committed to purifying the English church of remaining Roman Catholic influences, that it was necessary to gather a people and go on an errand into the wilderness, and that ended up being Massachusetts Bay, for the purpose of establishing some kind of model church-state commonwealth by which individuals could come together and organize a church that would assist those saints among them to realize the most important thing in this world, which was their salvation in the next. He was, by type, an English Calvinist. He believed in God's sovereignty, God's absolute omnipotence. At the same time, he believed that to believe literally in this was to assume predestinarianism. He could not accept that. He believed the individual ought to have some range of autonomy, some chance to prove his worth to God. Therefore, he was, as an English Calvinist, one who believed in Scripture, the importance of living in accord with Scripture, and he believed that the best kind of community was one which established institutions that allowed the individual to live out his life most literally in accord with Scripture. And that was the ideal that drove him and other like-minded English Calvinists into this Puritan experiment in Massachusetts Bay.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very helpful summary of all of that. So he used that phrase, didn't he, in one of his early sermons, that he wanted to establish the city on the hill. That was the biblical reference to the kind of community that he wanted in this new world. It would be then, I think, out of that grew that whole idea that we would be the light to the nations eventually, and that we would be the people who would show how the biblical ideal could be actually lived out in a political situation. And I think that that's I should ask you more about that. The kind of community he envisioned then, or actually established, would really have an established religion then, wouldn't it? It would there would be a situation. That's what effectively happened in those colonies, right?
He was a medieval man in that sense. Mm-hmm. That is, he believed, and that's why he had to get out of England, that within one royal realm, within one kingdom, there could only be one religious truth. Mm-hmm. And he happened to believe that the Church of England's truth was not an adequate one, and therefore it was necessary to go to Massachusetts Bay to set up that ideal truth.
We would call that a theocracy, I suppose, in many ways. Or is that going too far?
That's going too far. That is, they believe very much that the purpose of the state was to assist the church. Reciprocally, however, the purpose of the church was to assist the state maintaining order and political responsibility. It was not a theocracy in the sense that this was a regime that was ruled by the priests. It was rather one in which there was an assumption of mutual responsibility and reinforcement. And there were endless quarrels in Massachusetts Bay between the clergy and political authorities over who has what kind of responsibility. Mm-hmm. But collectively, Puritans did assume that the purpose of their commonwealth was to better the individual and assist the individual in doing that which was most important in this world, and that was realizing eternal salvation for the individual.
Mm-hmm. Did that notion then, can you trace that history beyond that a little bit for me? The way that notion developed in other places in the United States, and how Winthrop's ideal spread and so on?
Winthrop's ideals were mostly contained within Massachusetts Bay. There were other kinds of Christian reformers who went elsewhere in the colonies, and luckily for North America, some Quakers came who believed in the idea that of religious toleration, that there ought to be that religious pluralism, in effect, could survive in the New World as well as in the world at large. But in Massachusetts Bay, the originating hope and expectation was that these people would not have to spend the rest of their lives in the wilderness in North America. Rather, they believed in the 1620s, as they prepared to go into North America, that the Protestant-Catholic conflict in Europe was coming to such a head that that inevitably God would intervene once more in history and save his people, which were Calvinists. And as he saved his people and brought about an apocalypse, a collapse in the old world, European Protestants would look to a reformed, living Christianity in the New World. And that's why their notion not only was North America to be a city on the hill, but they were going on a temporary errand into the wilderness. And once the collapse came in the Old World, Reform-minded Protestants would look to them to reestablish in the Old World their model church-state commonwealth.
That they had established here.
That they had established
in other words, the flow would be back to Europe again.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's interesting because that whole idea of the American dream and how that is constituted. It's interesting how much of that American dream is biblically based then, and really has very much of an element of the God-human relationship in it, and all of the morality that the Bible would indicate, and so on. Give me a little more feel for life in that commonwealth that they were establishing there. What sort of moral emphases would they have had? And
well, they were people like us in many ways, and like contemporary Europeans, especially contemporary English of the 17th century in many ways. And that is, they were contentious, argumentative, agreeable. They varied. They were land-minded people for the most part. They were people who, from England, tended to be artisans. They had a little bit of a craft, or they had some property in England that they disposed of, and so they were a little bit of a middling sort, or a little bit better than a middling sort in England. But in England, they were considered religious eccentrics for their beliefs, because they took their Christianity so seriously. And so they happened to not so much be pushed from England as they chose to go to New England in order to see how they could live out this new way, which they thought would be the perfect way of European Christianity. They went, as you indicated, very much with the idea that they were in a special covenanted relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
Repeatedly, Winthrop, as well as other Massachusetts Bay clerical leaders, keep referring to themselves as the New Israelites. And this is something that's very much on their mind. And they talk about the voyage across the Atlantic as being one in which they're passing through the wilderness in the same way the ancient Israelites had. And so their thinking, by analogy, is very much that they literally are the New Israelites, and that they're bound in God's own purpose, God's own mission to North America, and that sooner or later he's going to call them back, because the promised land is in Europe, and that's where true Christianity has to start in its triumph. But
I think that strain changed in some degree, because I know there was a point in our history where people began to think that, as a matter of fact, the parousia, or the second coming, or the final establishment of the kingdom would be right here in the United States.
That's right.
That shifted after a while, so it wasn't so much a matter of returning in a way, but that the promised land was right here.
That's right.
And how about, did the religious figures hold tight rein on the activities of people? And
they tried.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the stories in North America is the fact that people would be able to go out and get the one thing they never had in Europe, which was land,
mm-hmm.
and with that be able to expand beyond the boundaries of the community. And this introduced chronic tensions within Massachusetts Bay, and that is because these people were ordinary folks of the time. They wanted land, they wanted material well-being, they wanted to satisfy their individual and family ambitions, and at the same time they, as well as the leaders, knew that this individual acquisitiveness was going to be taking place at the expense of the community integrity and the well-being of that biblical ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And so what resulted was a chronic quarreling within the different townships and villages in the colony over who was to get what land and how it was to be determined who got what land, and to what extent church leaders ought to have authority in determining these matters, and to what extent the church ought to stay out of it. These were argumentative, litigious people. They were people mm-hmm. like us in so many ways, and that mm-hmm. they never were able to resolve the tension between the individual commitment to well-being and the community good.
They knew those tensions even in that biblical. Yes. And also something that strikes me about that is the different situation in the United States was that people could always move on, that eventually if the tensions became too great in the Massachusetts Bay colony, that one would move on and found another colony. That's and right. That's where I think you would locate the whole westward movement. And the great influence that it has had on our notion of freedom. I know Sidney Mead is talked about that as shaping our sense of freedom and autonomy in the United States. Part of our individualistic sense is connected with the westward movement, because we could always have that new space, and there's always a new place to go and to found something different, and you could get away from the constraints that you found in some other geographical sector. I think John Kennedy played to that in a way with his whole new frontier idea in his campaign. In other words, you couldn't move westward anymore. The whole country was populated to start over, and so he resurrected that idea of the new frontier. It became a psychological barrier that one could overcome. There was no limit to what we could do. There was all kind of new possibilities and so on. And I think that grows right out of that original experience in the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
It does, absolutely. The reality of having something that Europeans never had in their past, and this limitless opportunity for physical expansion, encouraged this sense of geographical mobility, and with that, the sense of individual freedom. At the same time, it's curious that you mention it, but that notion of individualism only grew deeper as the Bible did encourage the notion, and this is in the case of Roger Williams, an important Puritan dissident of 1630s, that an individual could know the Bible on his own terms and defy church authority. And in Massachusetts Bay, not only did folks quarrel about land, but they also quarreled about church authority, as different individuals like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson said that God was speaking to them, and that they did not have to listen to what the church leaders were saying. And Winthrop found himself in constant quarrel with these kinds of people, and eventually they were banished, Williams into Rhode Island, and Anne Hutchinson back to England. But what resulted was a kind of sectarian breakup in which individuals claiming to have the truth spread out into their own communal enterprises.
Yeah, many people would say that that is sort of built into the whole Protestant experience, that as soon as one defies the Roman authority and goes in another direction, that there's no principle that would keep one from defying the new authority that would be set up. I mean, Luther found this already in his own time, of his own followers and disciples in a sense becoming more radical than he was, and they felt the need to disassociate from him. And that's been the history of Christianity since, is this fragmentation, and often based on the idea, well, I will interpret the Scriptures my way, and so on. And of course, I suppose the interesting thing from another viewpoint is that the Catholic community finds that same thing going on now, and that is the rising pluralism and diversity within the Catholic Church itself, and more people dissenting from certain views and thinking in their own way, and so on. So this is all connected with this rise of individualism. And I think that it's probably good to recognize that that really is a cultural phenomenon. We've been talking about it in biblical terms, or in the terms of the covenanted community, but similar things, of course, were going on in the culture as a whole, with the whole rise of the Enlightenment and individuals saying, well, I can think for myself, and I don't have to go along with what authority says, whether it's the king or whether it's the church or any other authority figure, that we are going to achieve happiness and fulfillment by thinking for ourselves and devising our own rules. In the philosophical world, I suppose Nietzsche would be the prime example of that in the 19th century, where he finally says, God is dead, and now all individuals, at least those who are with it and powerful and together, will create their own values, make their own life to be what it will be. And so I think it's good to locate this biblical movement that we're talking about in terms of the larger cultural movement, which has been in terms of disassociating from the community, getting away from the authority, relativizing all institutions, and building up the individual as the one who would make the decisions, and, as you suggested, even involved in a private interpretation of the Bible. So that Roger Williams then would move away, right, and found his own place, and so on.
The cultural and philosophical element is very important. At the same time, the economic dimension was highly important to 17th century Puritan New Englanders. That is, in order to maintain their vision of the city on the hill, that implied a certain inward-lookingness and provincialism, and living by themselves on their own in an economically self-sufficient way. The economic realities of the mid-17th century came to be that civil war and revolution overtook England, and they were cut off for a while commercially from England. And then, in order to survive, they found themselves thrown into the Atlantic trading system. And with that, they found that they had to open their community to outsiders. And as outsiders came in with different values. Merchants came in with material values, which only reinforced the desire for individual gain and acquisitiveness already felt by large numbers of these Puritan middle-class New Englanders. And so it only, the reality of needing to survive only bred the desire to gain more materially for an individual. And all of this took place at the expense of the communitarian ideals of John Winthrop.
Mm-hmm. Did he have a lot of trouble with what was going on? I mean, did he have fears about the breakup of the Commonwealth and the rise of individualism? Did he see that problem?
He felt it, he saw it, he tried to counter it, but he didn't know how to deal with it because on the one hand he understood the need. First of all, he assumed as a good Calvinist that people were corrupt and that were prone to pursue their own individual self-interest. But at the same time, he believed that while he had to deal with that as a reality, that he could not conceive of any ways, and he tried very hard to combat this fragmentation.
In other words,
almost atomism.
Yeah, in other words, he's fighting the same kind of problem that we are today in terms of the fragmentation, in terms of finding cultural ideals that hold the community together, of finding religious values that people will share, of finding a common language that people can talk about the great realities and so on. All the things that we're sensing today that we need some glue to hold us together, and people are too individuated and so on. They already saw that problem then.
They not only saw it, they lived it, and it afflicted them deeply. They grieved about it as they tried to figure out ways to overcome it.
I was thinking about de Tocqueville in the 1830s when he came to the United States. Of course, he had then more history to go with, and the rise of individualism he could see happening in this country, and in many ways feared that. And I think that he feared it from the viewpoint that it could give rise to sort of a new despotism, some sort of new tyranny could take over if indeed you get too fragmented. Eventually the culture doesn't hold together, crime increases, people don't know how to take care of the common good, everyone's doing their own thing, and eventually someone needs to step in, or at least it's ripe for a tyrant, a despot, someone who'll say, no, we're going to control this crime, or we're going to control these people, or we're going to get it all back together. And I think he feared that kind of despotism, and analyzed our culture in terms of this rise of individualism and the breakdown of the community-minded spirit, of the interest in the common weal. And again, that, you look at our situation today, and a lot of times when things are out of control, and you wonder if the government can handle things and so on, and you got the problem of terrorism. I think always lurking in the background is that fear of the rise of the tyrant, of the person who somehow is going to control all this, and the masses saying, yeah, we need somebody to get rid of all these amendments to the Constitution, or all of this excessive freedom that people have. We need to control. And then you end up not with a community, not a biblical ideal of the people of God, but you end up with a collectivity, with a totalitarian kind of state, the kind of thing that we would know in Soviet Russia and so on. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that's one of the modern playoffs of this.
Oh yes, and it was something that Winthrop knew in his own time too. That is, there was this very great fear of the people ruling directly and then collapsing in upon themselves in their selfishness and fears of disorder, and turning over control of a plebiscitary community to some kind of new tyrannical force. They would recall it going back to the Protestant Revolutionary Wars, the Reformation Wars of the 1530s, in which the so-called saints rose up in Munster and other places in the Germanies and claimed the rule of the saints, and proceeded to butcher one another as each one individually claimed to be the truth. And what resulted was widespread disorder and chaos, and then the imposition of military rule.
So they had a historical precedent, and when they looked at that, they feared that could indeed happen here.
Yes, they did.
Mm-hmm. Chuck, we should talk a little bit, I think, about what this biblical tradition of individualism could teach us today as we face our own fragmented society, and as people feel perhaps an emptiness in their individuality. And I think that the Bible does sort of represent an ideal where the two go together, where one finds one's dignity and worth precisely in the community. that you look at the New Testament and you see Jesus forming his group and calling his followers and sending them out to preach and so on, and they are called into communion with him, into discipleship with Christ, and yet in doing that, it seems as though their worth and dignity is enhanced, that their freedom is increased as they begin to live and move in that larger kind of community. It suggests to us that that the individual and the community are not necessarily in tension the way we think of it. In other words, we think if we're in community or we're in closer relationships or bound up in institutions, it will decrease our autonomy, that we will be less human and will be enslaved in some ways. And yet the Bible suggests, that whole biblical tradition, that it is not that way, that freedom can be attained precisely within the community, because freedom is not just freedom from, to get away from things, but freedom is also for. It is for being our better selves, for commitment, for dedication, for contributing to the common good. And I think that we're almost totally centered in on this freedom from, like we were saying geographically, you get away, you go other places. And yet the Bible suggests there is a freedom for that is bound up with intimacy, with closeness, with being a member of a people. Does that ring any bells with you? Or
with John Winthrop, it was very immediate. That was his understanding of freedom. A person like Roger Williams would represent the wrong kind of freedom, the freedom from. The throwing off of established authority and seeking out truth and wisdom on an individual basis. And to Winthrop, that defied authority, and that defied the kind of orderly system that he saw prescribed in Scripture, and that he thought was God's way in this world. John Winthrop and these 17th century Puritans very much believed that the only kind of real freedom existed within the community.
Well, that's a good historical precedent, I think. Well, Chuck, we've been talking about individualism and sort of the strand of individualism that we find in the biblical tradition. And in the Bible, we find this ideal of the community, the individual finding fulfillment within the community. And we find that historically this was attempted to be lived out anyway, right here in the New World. It's part of our own founding tradition. That biblical tradition is still in our bones and blood, and many people who have even rejected it still call upon it in some ways, or are still touched by it, because I think it's built into our American character. It has a lot to do with saying that God calls us as a people and to witness to others, but in that community we are to find our own strength, and develop our own talents and gifts.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Dr. Charles D. Benedetti, professor of history at the University of Toledo. Comments or questions on this show, or suggestions for future topics, should be sent to Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Campaign of the Diocese of Toledo.